Okay, hello dear friends. This is a lecture on the history of internet governance. If we talk about the internet, I've always asked the question, about the birthday of the internet, because if we look back, we have to understand our history if we want to understand the future of the internet and of the internet tomorrow. And if I ask students about the birthday of the internet, I get a number of answers. Some people say it started in the early 90s with the World Wide Web. Others say, oh, no, it started in 1974 when Cerf and Bob Kahn invented the TCP/IP protocol. Others go back to the year 1969 when we had the first network with 4 connected computers. But why in 1969 4 computers were connected in California and in Utah in the United States of America? The reason goes back to 1957, and this is when in the midst of the Cold War, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite, the first Sputnik, which was seen in the US as the Sputnik shock, because this was seen as a military threat that the Soviet Union suddenly demonstrated the capability to attack the United States of America via the outer space. And this led to a number of reactions in the United States, and the president of this time, Mr. Eisenhower, organized a discussion and said, we have to react to this new challenge. And there were 2 concrete reactions to this challenge. It was in 1958 when then Eisenhower signed 2 bills. One created the NASA. The Eisenhower argued, we lost the run for the outer space, but now we have to win the run to the moon, and the United States has to be the first man on the moon. And the second organization, which was created as a reaction to the Sputnik shock, was the ARPA, the Advanced Research Project Agency, under the leadership of the US Defense Department. And the ARPA got the mandate to investigate what would be the right reactions to this new military challenge. And among the discussions which started then in the 1960s, mainly pushed forward by the Rand Corporation, there was one idea which said, okay, what would be a potential target for the Russians to attack in the United States? And one answer to this question was probably they want to attack our communication systems, because communication is crucial for the functioning of a society. In the last century, when there was a coup d'etat or a revolution, people always took first the broadcasting station and the telecom office to get the communication under control. And all the traditional communication systems are centralized systems, with a central authority. With broadcasting, you have, one sender, or telecom, you had one main switching station. And so to occupy the center was occupying and controlling the communication. And so was also the military communication was organized in a centralized way. And so the idea came up in the 60s, why not to have a decentralized communication system where an attacker cannot destroy with one hit the central communication capabilities. And so, within a series of discussions and studies and papers, the idea emerged, to connect computers not in a hierarchical way, but in a network way, where each of the member of the network would have the same function, could be both receiver and sender. And this took place as a first test, indeed, in 1969, 12 years after the Sputnik shock, among 4 universities in the United States of America. It was the University of Santa Barbara, it was Stanford, it was the University of California in Los Angeles, and the University of Utah, military university. So this is probably the story behind the internet, which was financed and pushed forward by the Defense Department. But the other part of the story is that the real work was done in the 1960s by graduate students in California, and this was a special culture in California in particular. So that means you remember songs of this time on San Francisco and the hippie time. It was the time of the fight against the Vietnam War. So this was a special culture. So if you go to San Francisco via flowers in your hair, this was flower power and not a military time for the graduate students. And so there was, from the early beginning, two different cultures became interwoven. So on the one hand, the military had some plans. On the other hand, the researchers came from a culture which was not so directly linked to military purposes. And there was is a discussion since that among a lot of people who say, was this really a military thing, or was it just a civil thing pushed by engineers and students who wanted to connect computers? And just recently in a Time magazine, Isaac Jacobsen interviewed both the former director of the ARPA and Steve Crocker, who was a research student at this time, now the chair of the ICANN board. And both argued in a different way, because the chair from the ARPA argued, okay, we gave the money and we instructed them what they should do. But the Steve Crocker said, okay, we just were excited students who wanted to connect computers and to test something which is new. And then the ARPA boss said, okay, we were on the top and you were on the bottom, so we had no clue what is behind the scene. And Steve Crocker argued, we were on the bottom and you were on the top and you had no idea what we are doing. And so from the early beginning, so there was this, hybrid situation between a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. And this is still today a very relevant theoretical question, and I will come back to this a little bit later. But in the end of the 1960s, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, improved. There was the first negotiations on the limitation and later on the reduction of nuclear weapons. And so the military nature of the research project came down, but what remained was the new capabilities to communicate on an equal footing among computers in networks. And so a number of networks emerged, and this was taken over then by the academics, which said this is a wonderful tool for enhancing communication among researchers. And this was the moment when in 1974 the various existing networks, it was the ARPANET in the mainland of the United States, it was the SATNet which linked Hawaii to California, and it was the ALOANet which linked Hawaii to California, and the SATNet linked Europe to the East Coast. And to link the networks together, this was the main achievement from the TCP/IP protocol, which enabled that one computer in the ALOANet could communicate with one computer in the SATNet. So that means from Hawaii, you could communicate directly to Europe, to Norway, to France, to the United Kingdom. And this way was paved by this protocol invented by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. That's why the two guys are labeled today as the fathers of the internet. So that means the whole 70s and 80s, the internet architecture was developed mainly by academics, and this was a purely academic world at this time, with its own culture. So, but when Tim Berners-Lee invented in the early 1990s the World Wide Web and the HTTP protocol, so this opened the door for a new use of the internet, not only for academic purposes, but also for commercial purposes. And what we did see in the 1990s was the so-called .com boom. Immediately people realized that with a website, they can do a lot of things which went beyond a purely academic communications. They could start to sell products, they could start to advertise anything. They could, deliver all kinds of services with new applications. And so we saw an extremely growth of using the internet for all kinds of purposes which had nothing to do with military or academic communication. So, this extreme growth led to the situation that the number of internet users grew from 1 million to 10 million to 100 million to 1 billion. And when it crossed the 1 billion line, this was in the beginning of the year 2000, then this became a more political issue, and the internet became mass media for people to get information, to communicate among each other. So it was practically a combination of traditional mass communication, telecommunication, and data communication. So we talked about convergence and new forms of communication among individuals, which created also then the social networks or enabled the establishment of social networks. And this was the moment when policymakers became more interested in the internet, and this was reflected in the World Summit on the Information Society, which was organized by the United Nations. The first phase took place in Geneva in 2003, followed by a second phase in Tunis in 2005. And this so-called Tunis Agenda, created a framework for policy making for the internet. And what we have now today is what I have called Wave 5, is that the internet is now for everybody and everything. So while we had probably separated worlds 10 or 15 years ago, the real world here and the virtual world there, now the virtual world is part of our real world, and we cannot separate anymore the real world from the virtual world. The world would collapse if we would have no internet. The economy would collapse. And this is what I call the new internet complexity, where we have a lot of new political initiatives like the Net Mundial initiative. I will talk to this a little bit later. And the perspective of an internet of things where not only people and computer are connected, but all things are connected. Our cars, our clothes, our shoes, our glasses, and something else. So this is in short the history of the internet governance, and this has to be put into the broader context of the history of our society. 30 years ago, Alvin Toffler, an American sociologist, published a good book with the title 3 Waves. And he introduced, this structure, this historical approach to our development of the society, when he said, okay, we started with the agricultural society, and then we moved to the industrial society, and we end up with the information society. And while this is continuation and evolution, we have some remarkable differences between the different societies. So the agricultural societies is based on land and labor, and the governance model were absolutistic monarchies, kingdoms, and this is called feudalism. So, but when the Industrial Revolution emerged in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and in particular the 19th century, people realized that land and labor is not enough, you need capital. And this is why then we called this society also capitalism. And one reaction was that we had a power struggle, who makes the political decision, the king or a parliament, and we had then a battle between the palace and the parliament and a power shift, and democratic ideas emerged about a decentralization of power against absolutistic monarchies, so that we have a separation between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. This was introduced by people like Montesquieu or James Madison and others. And this is more or less the system we had the last 200 years. But now we have the information revolution, and we realize that land, labor, and capital is not enough. The oil of the 21st century is data, information. So, and insofar, so probably we will call this society, which is still in its early stage, datalism. instead of capitalism, because the driving force for all these developments is indeed data, megadata. So that means the data you produce and on a daily basis, and this is the resource where you can make money. So, and this will have consequences for the governance mechanism. So that means what I expect is that we see further decentralization of decision making, and we will see a power shift from our traditional and parliamental and governmental mechanisms to a multi-layer, multi-player, multi-stakeholder mechanism. So we are in the early days of such a development, and I wanted to put this here at the beginning of this lecture, that you put all the coming issues on internet governance into the right context. Furthermore, you have to understand a number of internet specifics. This belongs to the architectural design of the internet, the nature of resources, and the type of regulations. With regard to the architectural design, it's important to remember why the internet was developed. To change a centralized communication system into a decentralized communication system, so which is based on the end-to-end principle. In a hierarchical system, you have a top-down communication flow. So that means you have a sender and you have a receiver. But the internet is based on an end-to-end principle where everybody can be a sender and everybody can be a receiver. And the end users are connected via servers in a network. So that means this is an important architectural design which has far-reaching consequences for the way how it's governed and how you manage all the communication which takes place and is enabled via the network. The second important thing is you have to understand the nature of resources. You know, in the industrial society, the main resources were coal, oil, and all the natural resources, minerals, and things like that. All these resources from the industrial society are limited resources. They are linked to a territory. Your oil is in the Middle East. And they are also resources which will disappear if you use them. If you, drive a car with your gasoline and after 200 or 300 miles, you have to refill the car because the resource is gone. So, but the resources for the internet are different. The main resources for the internet are protocols, names, and numbers. And these are unlimited resources, which are not territorial and which are reusable. That means you can use an IP address again and again and again. It doesn't disappear. So, and it's unlimited. Even with IP version 4, you have a certain limitation. There are only 4 billion IP4 addresses. But with IP version 6, you have zillions of IP addresses. So that's really an unlimited resources. And with domain names, as you will see a little bit later, so we have also an unlimited resource here, so you can add generic top-level domains, thousands, 10,000s, or even more. And even if you have a linkage to a country, my so-called country code, top-level domains like .br for Brazil or .de for Germany. So this is only 240 domains which have this linkage, and a lot of country codes are managed outside of the country because the delegation was done under specific procedures, and so there is no technical linkage between a territory and a country code for a domain name. And if it comes to regulation, so we see also a new development. So that means that technical code becomes more important than national or international laws. That does not mean that national laws or international treaties disappear in the internet. The internet is not a law-free zone, but more important are really now technical codes, mechanism for self-regulation or co-regulatory mechanism. So our traditional understanding that all problems in the world will be settled by a law adopted by a parliament doesn't work anymore. So that means we have a much more complex system if it comes to regulation. And for all this, the number of protocols has grown and grown and grown, and also the organizations, technical organizations, which take part on this endeavor, has grown over the years. So that means we have for all these protocols mainly adopted by the Internet Engineering Task Force on the way of so-called RFCs. These are requests for comments, which have a special procedure, how they emerge. And meanwhile, we have nearly 8,000 so-called RFCs, request for comments, and this is labeled as the law book of the Internet. And we have here all this, the AD, the TCP/IP, the mail protocol, the HTML protocol, now protocols for the Internet of Things, Wi-Fi, WiMAX. All this is regulated via code. And this has created also a number of organizations. The most important I have listed here with the Internet Architecture Board, the IETF, the IANA, ISOC, RIPE NCC, the World Wide Web Consortium, ICANN, the Number Resource Organization, this Internet Governance Forum, or now the recent one, the Net Mundial Initiative, which play a certain role in the governance of the Internet. Before we go more into the details, let me spend also some words about the domain name system, because this is labeled by many people as the so-called territory of cyberspace. That means if you want to do something on the Internet, you need an IP address and a domain name. Google.com is just a domain name. Facebook.com is just a domain name. In the industrial age, you needed land if you want to start a business, to build an empire, or to build a hotel or a factory. But in the Internet, the first thing you need is a domain name. And if you have registered a domain name, so then you can start to build your empire. And so this is an important difference, and insofar it's important to understand what numbers and names are in the so-called domain name system. So originally we had only numbers, like in the telephone or in the fax and the telegraph system. But numbers are not human, so that means it's nearly impossible to remember all the numbers. So IP version 4 address has 2 blocks. The first part of the address is the number for the network, and the second part of the address is the number for the computer. So to remember these numbers is complicated, in particular with IP version 6, where the number is much longer. And insofar, it was very natural that John Postel in the 1980s said, okay, can we give these numbers a human face by relating numbers to names? And he introduced a system, a 2-layer system, one where he said, okay, this is good for countries, and I give every country, which is listed on a list managed by the International Standardization Organization, 3166, and these countries get country code with 2 letters. And then I have some generic codes for the US, mil, gov, and edu, for military, government, and educational institutions, and 3 for the world, .com, .org, .net. And he said, so this is enough, then we have numbers we can remember. So, but sooner or later, then people realized that the generic top-level domains, this is too limited. In particular, after the World Wide Web emerged, people realized that they need more names. And so there is no technical barrier for names. And what we have seen in the last couple of years, in particular in the ICANN context, is that we have now a process where we add thousands probably new generic top-level domains, so that we can communicate in a much more human way, and names and numbers are important. So all this is supported by a so-called root server system, because the database for the names are in a root server, and to reduce the vulnerability, so the drafters of the design of the Internet have organized in a way that so you have 13 distributed root servers which have all the same set of data in their computer, which enable the communication among different domains. That means if you go from a .br domain to a .com domain, then you need a root server, because the root server has the information both from the DE and the BR domain and from the .com or .net domain. And so the root servers are important to enable the communication among the various domains. And here comes also the special role of the US government, because somebody has to decide which zone file for a top-level domain goes into the root. And because all this has developed in the United States, so far the US government has its hand on the way how top-level domains are delegated or finally put into the root server. So that means each zone file for a top-level domain needs the authorization by the US government, in particular the NTIA, which is the National Telecommunication and Information Administration under the US Department of Commerce. So, but this is a role which has been historically exercised by the US government. The US government announced already in 1998 that sooner or later they will hand over this function to ICANN, or to a multi-stakeholder mechanism. And the US government repeated this now in 2013, 2014, that they will use the termination of the so-called IANA contract in September 2015 to hand over those functions to the internet community. So there's a process underway at the moment, you know, how to organize the transition. If the transition is not possible until September 2015, there is an option to enlarge the contract for 2 years until 2017, and then for another 2 years until 2019. So that means there is a system now, a process underway. So, and all this has to be managed. And in the past, this was managed by one man alone, John Postel, who is seen as the father of the domain name system, together with Paul Mockapetris. And he was labeled the Tsar of the Internet in the early 1990s. And so he was the one man who managed the IANA. IANA stands for the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, which allocates IP addresses and which manages the domain name system. So this was done on the basis of a contract with the United States government. Postel worked in the University of Southern California on an Information Science Institute. And so the root server, the so-called A root server, now the hidden server, was managed by the Network Solution Incorporation, a private corporation, which is now VeriSign, which had also a contract with the United States government. And so ICANN was established in 1998 to overtake this function. That means to take it out of the hand of one man and to globalize and internationalize this. And so we have here a process which has been on the way in the last 15 years, and ICANN is now an established organization, and we are on the way to get full independence for ICANN when the IANA transition is completed. It's also important to remember some of the basic concepts which stand behind the development of the internet. So Tim Berners-Lee in 1991, when he invented the World Wide Web, said, you know, that his idea is and was that society can run without a hierarchical bureaucratic government being involved in every step, if only we can hit on the right set of rules for peer-to-peer interaction. Our design of the internet and the web is a search for a set of rules which will allow computers to work together in harmony. And our spiritual and social quest is for a set of rules which allow people to work together in harmony. So that means his idea was, okay, can we learn how to organize society from the architecture of the internet? Then we take inspiration from this. You know, Dave Clark, who was a chair of the Internet Society and of the Internet Engineering Task Force, you know, formulated this, what is seen as the leitmotif for the IETF until today. And he said, we do not believe in kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus, factual approach, and running code. So rough consensus and running code, this is, you know, how the internet should be managed according to Dave Clark, and the IETF has taken this as a leitmotif until today. So rough consensus is not voting. It's just, you know, discussing until you have more or less the agreement among key players. It's not 100% consensus. Rough consensus is rough consensus. And running code is, we are building on what we have achieved step by step. That's why we have to have open networks, not closed networks, so that we can add new layers, new services, and new applications on top of this. The most radical version came from John Peter Barlow, Declaration of Cyber Independence. He announced this in Davos on the eve of the World Economic Forum in 1996, when he said governments are not needed anymore. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. So this was a declaration for the split of the world, the old world with governments and the new world in cyberspace. 15 years later, 20 years later, we know that this is not the reality. The reality is that the two worlds are still there, and they have now emerged more or less. What I said in the beginning, that in wave 5 now the virtual world, the cyber world, becomes the real world. And insofar, this radical voice from John Peter Barlow is important to remember, because a lot of the problems we face with the internet are rooted in this approach. But we have to look to go beyond this and to look for new forms of coexistence and corporations and multi-stakeholder governance. So one key eye-opener was Larry Lessing's book when he wrote about code and other laws of cyberspace, where he opened us the eyes that he said that cyberspace is regulated in a different way, because it's regulated by code. And he said, we can build or architect and code cyberspace to protect values that we believe are fundamental, or we can allow those values to disappear. So that means he made clear that code is as important as law. And he also made clear that code is never founded, is only ever made, and only ever made by us. That means by man. And so the question is on the table. What is the relationship between lawmakers and code makers? So that means why lawmakers in the past defined, in how code could be developed. For instance, in the 20th century, it was not allowed to use certain devices in the telecom field. That means only governmental approved end devices could be used. So that means lawmakers created the space for the code makers. Now it's the code makers which define the space for the lawmakers. With all the new developments we have in the open innovate and with innovation without permission. So we have this battle between makers and lawmakers sometimes are really surprised that new codes undermine existing legislation, and we have to find a way for a new cooperation between code makers and lawmakers, between technical and political regulation. An important final quotation here comes from Vint Cerf, the father of the internet. When he invented this, he had no clue that the internet will become an infrastructure with 4 or 5 billion users. In an interview with Computer World from the year 2010, he said, the question was, would it be something that could be rolled out to the rest of the world? We didn't know for sure, but when we worked on it, we decided not to patent, not to copyright, not to control, but to share everything. We knew about the internet design to the general public all around the world. What is amazing is that it was a US Department of Defense project, and we were in the middle of the Cold War. In spite of all that, we made all this completely available to everybody. And the only reason it was possible is nobody paid any attention to us. I think this quotation has two important elements. The first thing is he did not patent, not copyright, not control, but to share everything. I think this is an important leitmotif also for the internet as a whole, sharing. No patent, no copyright. Now, I've asked Vint Cerf a couple of years ago in a panel in Geneva which I moderated, and Vint was on the podium. and asked it, what would you have, what would have happened if you would have copyrighted or patented the TCP/IP protocol? And he answered, probably I would be rich, or the internet would have never been developed in a way what we have today. So I think this is an important lesson. Sharing is much more important than copywriting or patenting or controlling. So, and the second lesson is nobody paid attention. That means it was done in the shadow of political battles. So it was done in a bottom-up way. So that means the power groups on the top of the political struggles didn't realize that something is going on the ground. And this was important. So this time is gone. Now governments, power holders understand what's going on. So that means it's now under focus. And this creates a lot of political problems we will see a little bit later. So how the DNS governance, the domain name system governance, has developed over the years. As I said already, in the beginning it was just the IANA, John Postel, with a contract with the US Department of Commerce. So he wanted to introduce already in the middle of the 90s new generic top-level domains under the umbrella of ISOC, the Internet Society. This failed, so he turned later to the ITU and the WIPO. The ITU is an UN organization as a WIPO, and the INTAD is the International Trademark Organization, because the trademark owners became very critical with the domain name system, because they feared that their trademarks, which has been protected in the real world, could be undermined by using trademarks also in the domain name world, and they feared that this goes out of control via cyber squatters. And so the INTA wanted to have a say in it. But also this effort to create a mechanism with intergovernmental organizations and trademark owners and technical community failed. And the US government undertook the initiative then in 1998 to produce a structure which would be able to manage all these domain names, IP addresses and protocols, and created a private corporation under Californian law, which was called ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. So this was under control of the US government. The first step into independence was made by the Obama administration in 2009, when they signed an affirmation of commitment with ICANN, which ended the so-called Memorandum of Understanding with the US Department of Commerce. And the remaining linkage to the US government is the so-called IANA contract. And this is now under discussion, as I have said a little bit earlier. ICANN is now a key player in the internet world. It has a mandate to manage root servers, domain names, and IP addresses. It has a very complex structure. It's led by a board of directors, so you have 16 voting members in the board, which are coming from different supporting organizations, advisory committees, and also via a nomination committee, where everybody can send in an application and statement of interest, and via a process which is defined in the ICANN bylaws, a nomination committee which represents all constituencies in ICANN select 8 directors for the board. That means half of the board directors are selected via a nomination committee, and the other half comes from supporting organizations and advisory committees. We have 3 supporting organizations, one representing the generic names, the other one the so-called country codes, and the ASO stands for the address community, the number community. And there are a number of advisory committees. One advisory committee is the GAC, where we have now nearly 150 governments represented. They can give the ICANN board advice. We have the at-large advisory committee, which represents the internet users, with around 250 so-called at-large structures around the globe, organized in 5 regional at-large organizations. We have the root server system advisory committee, which represents the 13 operators from the root server system, and also the more than 200 Anycast servers. And we have the Security and Stability Advisory Committee, which represents the security community, and then we have the so-called Technical Liaison Group, which represents technical experts and standardization organization like the IETF or the World Wide Web Consortium. So we have a number of accountability mechanisms within ICANN, and but accountability is an issue also for the future, and I come to this also a little bit later. The main principles on which this ICANN is built is security and stability, a bottom-up policy development process where everybody can be involved, the promotion of competition in the domain name market, and a multi-stakeholder model, globalization, where everybody can participate both in policy development and in decision-making. During the World Summit in Geneva in 2003, 5 years after ICANN was established, we had the first big political controversy around ICANN, because ICANN was done more or less, among a small number of activists from the various stakeholder groups, but a lot of countries, had no clue what happened in the 90s. And when the internet became so important that it became the subject of discussions in the World Summit, so we saw a controversy because some countries asked the questions, why we do not control this resource. So we control television, we control radio, we control news agencies and the press, why not the internet? And so the conflict which emerged in Geneva in 2003 was, should the internet be managed by the private sector, or should it be done by governments? So this was a conflict between the Chinese government and the US government. And while China said, okay, all this should be done by an intergovernmental organization like the United Nations or the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. So the United States government said, we have now ICANN. ICANN is a private corporation. That's the better place to manage this, and governments are involved via the Governmental Advisory Committee. But the Governmental Advisory Committee has only an advisory function in ICANN and not a decision-making. This is an important difference. And so the conflict was not settled. So there was also open, what we understand under internet governance. So we had a narrow definition that is only a technical thing, or a broad definition that is a political thing. And so the compromise was then, okay, let's broaden our approach, let's involve all stakeholders, and let's create a working group. And the working group on internet governance, the WCIG, was established then in 2004 by the UN Secretary General of the Kofi Annan. And this group, which included representatives from all stakeholder groups, came up with a definition what internet governance is. And this definition is really very crucial for the understanding also of the challenges of tomorrow if it comes to internet governance. So the definition is, it's just 4 lines, is internet governance is the development and application by governments, the private sector and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures and programs that shape the evolution and the use of the internet. So this has 3 parts. The first thing is internet governance is not for governments alone. So that means governments, the private sector and the civil society has to work hand in hand in their respective roles. That means the private sector cannot substitute the governments, but governments can also not do the work for the private sector. And the civil society has to be included in policy development and in decision making. The second part of the definition is probably even more important, in particular for the future, because the second part of the definition speaks about shared principle, norms, rules, and decision-making procedures. Sharing. So the key word comes back what Vint Cerf has said in his interview from 2010. So sharing is a key element for the internet. And sharing decision-making is a complicated process. So that means how to bring governments, private sector, and civil society into a mechanism where they can share decision-making. So this is a challenge for the future, which will produce a lot of problems, because traditionally government thinks they are the only decision makers, and they consult with other stakeholders and then they make decisions. But what is here in this definition is we have to go beyond this. So the situation is rather similar when we had first a king who made only the decisions after consultation with his ministers, and then a parliament came and said, wait a minute, so we want to have a say in certain decisions. So, and there was a question about, how to share decision making between the king and the governmental person, the prime minister or the president. So the British find a nice mechanism for this, which was called the constitutional monarchy. So, and there was a system of co-regulation or of shared decision-making. But over the years, the power moved out of the palace and into the parliament. And, with this definition, we have opened the door for a discussion. How in the 21st century, policy decisions can be shared among various stakeholders. And the final part of the definition makes an interesting difference between the evolution and the use of the internet. So these two words reflect the two layers of the internet. One is the development of the internet itself as a technical infrastructure, and the second part is the use of this infrastructure. So while this is interconnected, so the evolution and the use of the internet is, these are two sides of one coin. But each side of the coin, has a different nature and has to be treated differently. But it's interconnected, and this makes the problem also for the future, how to find the right combination between technical regulation and public policy regulation. So they cannot be separated, but they are different. So I think this is an important point. The Working Group on Internet Governance, the WCIG, also proposed a new space for discussion, because the argument was, okay, we have, before we make decisions, we have to understand the issues. And so the proposal was to establish an Internet Governance Forum, the so-called IGF, and, but they could not agree on oversight over ICANN. And this has led then to decisions by the Tunis Summit in the year 2005, which is still very relevant today. And the Tunis agenda, agreed on a number of very general principles. One is that indeed internet should be managed not by a governmental body, but by a mechanism which involves all stakeholders. The multi-stakeholder model has its root more or less in the Tunis agenda. At the same time, it confirmed that governments and countries have a certain sovereignty over their country code top-level domain. So that means that's also a mixture of a globalized system and a system where the nation-state have a certain say with their own country code top-level domain. But the internet is not only the country code top-level domain. That's why we also a hybrid system which creates some problems. And while the governmental role is certainly more with public policy issues, but they cannot settle public policy issues by ignoring the technical realities. So here again, we have to find combinations if we want to have sustainable solutions. So the Internet Governance Forum was decided to establish, and but the forum has no decision-making capacity. This is also important. It's just a discussion platform. This is important, but decisions, has to be made sooner or later, and so there is still a gap in the system. The gap in the system should be, so there was the idea to have a process which was called Process on Enhanced Cooperation, which was intended to create probably something new, where via enhanced communication, coordination and collaboration among the involved governmental and non-governmental institutions and organizations, new ideas could come up. So, but so far, after 10 years, so we are still in the process of discussion where we look for new innovative models where we can go beyond discussion and to find solutions for problems. That means new mechanisms and procedures for decision making. Since Tunis, a lot has happened. So I cannot go through all this. You see this on the slide. So we have in the ICANN context the affirmation of commitment, and now the announcement of the JANA transition, which I mentioned already. The Internet Governance Forum, meanwhile, had 10 meetings or 9 meetings. The 10th will take place in November in João Pessoa in Brazil in 2010. So a new initiative emerged with the Net Mundial conference, which took place in Sao Paulo in the year 2014 in April. And as a follow-up from this conference, which produced a declaration of principles and a roadmap, we have seen the emergence of an initiative called the Net Mundial Initiative, or NMI. You know, the United Nations has now worked on this in various directions. So they have various committees dealing with these issues. The Human Rights Council of the United Nations has started to discuss internet issues, in particular with regard to the right to freedom of expression and the right to privacy. They have special rapporteurs for this, you know, and an important role, growing important role, plays the issues of cybersecurity. There is a so-called group of governmental experts which are discussing issues like cyber war or confidence building measures, you know, cyber weapons and cybersecurity in the United Nations. That's the first committee. And the International Telecommunication Union plays an important role, but after a conference in Dubai 3 years ago, it's more or less clear that the efforts by some member states to bring the management of the domain names and IP addresses under control of an intergovernmental organization has failed. I come also to this issue back a little bit later. So the ITU has now realized that they have a certain role to play, but not in the fields of names and numbers. And under the new Secretary General, which is a guy from China, Hulin Zhao, the relationship between ITU and ICANN has significantly improved, and we are moving now from ignorance to collaboration on the basis of reciprocity. But a lot of other organizations have also, since Tunis, you know, played a role in the internet governance. It was the G8 who had this issue on its agenda under the French presidency, and the Deauville Declaration from 2011 is an important document you should remember. Other UN organizations like the World Trade Organizations, the WIPO, the UNESCO are active. The OECD has adopted a declaration. The Council of Europe has adopted a declaration. The European Union is active. The African Union is active. The BRICS countries now, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, you know, have drafted a convention on cybersecurity, the so-called Shanghai Group. China, Russia, and some former Asian Soviet republics, you know, are developing concepts for cybersecurity. The so-called IPSA countries, India, Brazil, and South Africa, have made some proposals. And this is what I call the new internet governance complexity. So it gets so complex and so many players are involved that it's not easy to understand all this. So one challenge is that we move to a multi-stakeholder mechanism versus a one-stakeholder mechanism. So that means all the players have to understand that they are not the only band in town. So they have to share policy development and decision-making with other players in the so-called internet governance ecosystem. This leads to innovations in international law, diplomacy, and decision-making. So while we have on the one hand a confirmation that international law does not disappear, but we have to understand also that we are now on a new level, which is much more complex. So international law is just one part. It's not the only part. So the international treaty system will not disappear, but it's embedded now in a multi-stakeholder environment. What we have to clear is what is the future role of governments. So probably one thing is for sure, that they will not get back the only decision-making capacity. But the question is, what is the legitimacy and the accountability of non-governmental stakeholders, and how the collaboration between governmental and non-governmental stakeholders can be developed if it comes to decision-making, to norm setting and all this. So these are open questions for the future. And also, you know, what is the most appropriate bodies for discussions and decision making. Is it ICANN, is it the IGF, the Net Mundial Initiative, the United Nations, the G7, BRICS, G20. So that means how to bring all this into a reasonable mechanism where we have enhanced communication among all these players. And then probably we have to go beyond traditional legal instruments like conventions and declarations. What we have seen now is the emergence of new acronyms like AOC, which stands for Affirmation of Commitment, LOI, this is a letter of intent, MOU, this is a memorandum of understanding, FOC, this is a framework of commitment. So that means we have to be innovative also if it comes to legal instruments and outcomes. So all this forms together what is called now the Internet governance ecosystem. So in the ecosystem we have now 4 main players. One is the technical community with all the so-called ISTAR organizations, and then with a lot of other groups, including the anti-phishing working group, you know, the anti-spam working group, and other groups, you know, which are dealing with very concrete technical issues. Then we have the governments and all the organizations in the UN system or on a regional level, like Shanghai Group, the European Union, or the African Union. And then we have all the businesses with its global networks like the International Chamber of Commerce, the World Economic Forum, WITSA, the CCIA, the Global Network Initiative, and then we have the big players from the US and from China. So these are really the big shots. In the US they are called now GAFA or GAFAC, which includes Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon and Cisco. And in China we have more or less the big players are called Baidu, Alibaba, Huawei, Xiaomi, China Mobile, Taobao and others. So while Africans, Latin Americans and even Europeans have no big player in the business, so this is also an interesting and important part of the Internet governance ecosystem, that we have really very, very big corporations here fighting for markets. And then we have all the civil society organizations. APC stands for the Association for Progressive Communication, Human Rights Watch, Reporter Without Frontiers, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the American Civil Liberty Union, ALAC, the At-Large Advisory Committee from ICANN, the Non-Commercial User Constituency, and a lot of other best bits, GNC, CBSR, Access, ETRI. So all these are players in the Internet governance ecosystem. And nobody has a leading role, and there's no central place. That means this is a big challenge to move forward, to stumbling forward in a model where the stakeholders play an equal role in their respective roles in a bottom-up policy process, and you all keep this as transparent and open as possible. So over the years we have seen now 4 different multi-stakeholder models. The first thing is ICANN, which has pioneered all this, but at the end of the day, it's the private sector which takes final decisions. So the governmental advisory committee gives only advice. In the World Summit on the Information Society, it's just different. So the final decisions are made by governments. So that means the private sector, civil society, the technical community give the advice. In the Internet Governance Forum, we have no decision at all. It's just for discussion. But the Net Mundial initiative in April 2014 in Sao Paulo demonstrated that it's possible on the basis of rough consensus to take decisions also in a multi-stakeholder setting. So this is the models we have, and we have to move forward in a way learning by doing. So and insofar it's again useful to remember the definition of Internet governance from the Tunis Agenda, and to make this differentiation between governance of the Internet and governance on the Internet. Of the Internet, these are the technical issues, domain names, IP numbers, protocols, and the root server system, so I have explained that already. But in the governance on the Internet, so we can probably pack all the issues. The UNCSTD, a UN group, has defined or identified more than 550 public policy issues. So we can probably put all these 550 internet-related public policy issues into 4 baskets. So my proposal is here to have a cybersecurity basket where we discuss all this cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime issues, and where we have already a basis from the group of governmental experts in the United Nations, which has also declared that international law is relevant offline and online. So we have a second basket, which is the cyber economy, where we have to discuss all this e-commerce, e-trade, industry 4.0, intellectual property issues, and the related legal issues, jurisdiction, taxation, data protection. These are all important issues. A third basket could be the human rights basket, where we discuss the privacy, freedom of expression issues, freedom of association, consumer protection, and fortunately the Human Rights Council of the United Nations has also declared that individual human rights are the same offline and online. So there is no need for new legislation, but we have to be creative, how to adjust or how to use and implement existing human rights instruments in the online world. And then we have a new basket 4, technology, with all the new emerging things like the Internet of Things, big data, cloud computing, etc. But what we will see here, if we move forward, that we have a clash of cultures, because governmental state policies are rather different from non-governmental stakeholder policies. So the players are different. Here we have governments, well-defined, organized, from dictatorships to democracies. On the other hand, we have in the stakeholder part, we have more or less constituencies, which are organized very often across borders as global constituencies. For instance, in ICANN, so we have the constituencies for the generic top-level domains. So these are registries which offer domain names across borders, so they cannot be linked to a specific country. The internet users cannot be linked to a specific country. The large advisory committee includes groups from all continents. So this is a rather big difference with regard to the players. Also, the architectural organization, the design is different. A state is organized in a hierarchy. The stakeholders are organized in networks. States are working on the basis of laws. Stakeholders are working on the basis of code. So processes in a state is top-down mainly. In stakeholder groups, this is bottom-up. States are working on the basis of voting. Stakeholders are satisfied with rough consensus. In a government, you see a lot of processes behind closed doors. In multi-stakeholder processes, they are open and transparent. In a government, they are confronted with lobbying. In the multi-stakeholder model, you have things like public comment, where everybody can make a comment. So this is a big issue for the future. And so the question is, after the clash became visible in Dubai in 2012 with the World Conference on International Telecommunication, the issue on the table is, will be able to organize a cyber coexistence in what I call the rainforest of the cyberspace, where we have a lot of different species and animals and plants which live or fight each other together on the basis of different regimes, or we will have a Cold War where we really, fighting each other. So the big issues are cybersecurity, economy, human rights, and the conflicts are, should this be regulated via intergovernmental treaty or in a multi-stakeholder collaborative way? Should the internet remain global and open, or should the internet become nationalized and fragmented? We see the conflict between the old new economy and the new economy. So on the one hand, we have in the old new economy, the broadcasters, the telecom operators, and publishers. In the new economy, we have the social networks, we have the search engines. So you see this in very concrete questions with traditional taxi driver on the one hand and Uber as a new service on the other hand, and all this will go through the whole economy, that we have a fight between traditional and innovative new services and applications, and this will overshadow a lot of the political discussions. And from a political point of view, the issue is on the table whether the so-called representative democracy, which has worked quite well the last 100 years, at least in the Western world, so whether this is enough or we should enlarge this and to include more participatory elements towards a participatory democracy. This is also a big issue, how to organize participation in a way. So that means the participatory democracy, at least in the next 100 years, will not substitute the representative democracy. But we have to find a way to, for a mixed model where we combine in a very intelligent way representation with participation. What is the agenda for this year and for the next year? So ICANN has a long agenda. I will not go through all the issues here listed on the slide. So the big two issues for ICANN is the IANA transition and the so-called accountability. So that means ICANN has created a number of processes and organizations for the IANA transition. We have the so-called IANA transition coordination group, and this has three subgroups, one responsible for names like the CWG, one for numbers, this is the, and one for the protocols, this is the IANA plan. And then we have another second group, the so-called cross-community working group for accountability. So the plan is that these two groups, which include more than 1,000 people from all constituencies and stakeholder groups, that these two groups in an open and transparent bottom-up processes produce concrete proposal how on the one hand the IANA transition can be implemented, and on the other hand how in the midterm the accountability of IANA can be strengthened so that ICANN, if it leaves the control by the US government, can be in a safe harbor and cannot be misused. I think ICANN has now a budget of $120 million, and you have to annually, and you have to make sure that the money is not misused. So that means in a hearing in the US Congress recently, a senator asked people, how you can make sure that ICANN does not become a FIFA, where also big money is in play and FIFA is not controlled by governments. And so far the question is how you can have safe accountability mechanisms in such a big network which deals with millions of dollars so that you can exclude corruption or misuse. So I think this is an important process, and everybody, in particular you, as a potential leader of the internet governance world of tomorrow, should be participate in this, to have safe mechanisms so that ICANN remains committed to the public interest, remains committed to the visions and dreams and ideals of the founding fathers of the internet, and is not misused when it's sandwiched between power and money games. So insofar, you need good review mechanisms. You have to have mechanisms in place which guarantee the security and stability, which allows in the broadening of the market with new GTLDs for globalization with internationalized domain names. I think this is in particular important so that people in countries which are using a different alphabet and not the Latin alphabet, they can make use of the internet domain name system in their own script, Chinese, Tamil, Greek or whatsoever, like Cyrillic. You have to move forward with the transition to IP version 6, and a lot of more things are to do. So the Internet Governance Forum, after 10 years, is it probably now the most accepted discussion platform in the world. So at the moment we are waiting for a renewal of the mandate. This has to be done by the General Conference of the United Nations, the General Assembly. And we expect this decision will be made in December in 2015 in New York. A lot of people who are in favor of the IGF but are also critical say, you know, we have to have a greater outcome from the processes, from the discussion. So that means it's not enough to have discussions. We have to have also concrete results. And so what is discussed at the moment in the IGF Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group is interim results like best practice documents. This could be helpful. This is not a legal binding document, but you know, this summarizes experiences in different countries and could be used as a guideline. So that means we have to go also beyond this only annual meeting with more intersessional work. There are institutions like the dynamic coalitions which make useful work between the IGFs. The secretary and the multi-stakeholder advisory group has to be strengthened so that they can be also more operational. And we have meanwhile already a timetable. So with candidates for 2016, 2017 and 2018, Mexico is already fixed for 2016, and there are plans, as far as I have heard, to have the IGF in Beijing in 2017 and in Berlin in 2018. So a big achievement is that the IGF, without any involvement of the United Nations, has produced so-called regional internet governance fora around the world. So in Europe, we have probably the most established with the EuroDIC, which takes place since 2008, and with now a bigger involvement not only of the Council of Europe, but also of the European Commission, the European Broadcasting Union, and a lot of other European institutions supported by the private sector in Europe and by a lot of civil society organizations. So this year it was in Sofia, next year it will take in Brussels. And you see here the list of all the hosts for the EuroDIC. And we have similar regional IGFs in the Asia-Pacific region. In Africa, we have also sub-regional IGFs in Central, West and East Africa. We have IGFs in Latin American region, in the Arab region, and then we have national IGFs in more than 25 countries now, from UK, Finland to Canada and the Ukraine. The United Nations has also a big agenda for 2015. The most important thing is the so-called high-level meeting in New York in December 2015, where we have a review of the Tunis agenda. So, and this will be an important meeting. The problem is that this is only an intergovernmental meeting. So that means the decision by the United Nations was to have a two-layer process. So in the first phase, they have so-called multi-stakeholder consultations, where non-governmental stakeholders can participate in discussion, but this will then feed into a purely intergovernmental committee, which will propose the final documents for the high-level meeting in New York in December 2015. Let's wait and see what the outcome will be here. And it's important to say also after 10 years that on the one hand, the Tunis agenda was a great guideline for moving forward. And I think the main objectives formulated in Geneva and in Tunis in the World Summit on the Information Society in bridging the digital divide, has resulted in good progress. But on the other hand, the aim in Tunis was to bring half of mankind online until the year 2015. With 3.5 billion internet users, more or less this has been achieved. But this means also that 3.5 billion people are still offline. And I'm sorry for this interruption. So, but you see the internet world And the online world is always around you, even if you are sitting in a studio and give here a lecture. So anyhow, you know, the problem is, and this is what I wanted to say here, is that the Tunis agenda has opened the door for a lot of progress, but a lot of things has to be done. And we have still 3.5 million people which are not online, and this has to be changed until the year 2025. So with the enhanced cooperation, we have not really progressed, so we are still looking forward how we can move from discussion to action and find solutions. The ITU as a separate organization continues to work via a ITU Council Working Group on Internet Governance, and we will have soon the next World Telecommunication Policy Conference. And as I said earlier, the UN General Assembly is now an important place to discuss internet issues in the 3 committees. The first committee discusses security issues, in particular cyber war and confidence building measures. The second committee discusses economic issues, and the third committee all the human rights issues. So, and we have summits of the governments. The G7 summit is in Germany in June, the BRICS summit in Ufa in Russia in July, and the G20 in Turkey in October. And it remains to be seen how the world leaders, you know, will deal with the internet. A new initiative came out with the Net Mundial initiative. This was driven by the revelations of Mr. Snowden in the year 2013, which triggered a discussion among a number of stakeholders, the technical community, governments, about trust in the internet, and there was a consensus that something has to be done, and we need a reaction to this. And the outcome was that the president of Brazil, Madame Rousseff, said, okay, we just to have an intergovernmental treaty against this is probably not the right approach. So we have to bring all stakeholders on the table and to agree on a number of principles and a roadmap. And this happened in Sao Paulo in 2014. So we have now a declaration of principles which is supported not only by governments, but also by the private sector, by civil society, and the technical community. And all the main players were in Sao Paulo. So the commitment to the Sao Paulo principles is a very strong commitment. And insofar, this declaration of internet governance principles from Sao Paulo constitutes something like the framework for the internet. I have compared this sometimes to the Declaration on Human Rights from 1948, which was also not an intergovernmental treaty, but after the shock of World War II and in 1945, the stakeholders at this time, only governments, said, we have to have a certain framework as guidelines for our behavior. And so the declaration, Human Rights Declaration from 1948, reflected this conclusion after World War II. And insofar, the Sao Paulo principles reflect the shock from the Snowden revelation and say, this is what we expect. This is good behavior on the internet if you follow these principles. And even more, the Sao Paulo declaration gave also a guideline for the next steps in form of the so-called roadmap, which is now implemented by new network, which is called the Net Mundial Initiative, NMI, which is a joint initiative by ICANN, the Brazilian Internet Organization CGI-BR, and by the World Economic Forum from Davos. And the intention of this initiative is not only talking the talk, but also walking the walk. That means to move from discussion to implementation. So probably there is no need for new instruments and for new debates. We have all the issues on the table. We have now to move towards implementation. And so the Net Mundial initiative could become something like the Internet Governance Clearinghouse or Observatory, which says, okay, here is an issue, this has to be settled, and now we organize a certain push that the issue can be settled in the so-called Coordination Council. From the Net Mundial initiative, you have all regions and all stakeholders involved. So that means we have 5 regions and 4 stakeholder groups, and we have now in this council a representative from the civil society in Africa, from the technical community in Africa, from the business in Africa, and also from the government in Africa. And also the other regions are represented by rather high-level people. Human Rights Watch is involved from the civil society groups, the World Wide Web Consortium, from the technical community. We have from the private sector community is Alibaba, the Chinese e-commerce provider, involved, and then we have ministers from the US, Penny Pritzker, the Secretary of Commerce, or China's Liu Wei, the minister from the Chinese administration on the internet, cyberspace administration. So this is a new initiative. So the first meeting of this initiative of the council has taken place end of June in Sao Paulo. So we are working on the terms of reference, and some projects will emerge in the future. So this brings me to the end of the lecture. If we look ahead in the year 2020, what can be said? It's difficult to make any forecast in the future. So in 2020, we will have probably 5 billion internet users. We will have a multilingual internet, all kinds of converged services, Web 4.0. We will have the Internet of Things. Probably we have applications which go beyond the domain name system. The network, it's open questions whether we will stay for one unified global internet, or whether the internet will fragment it into parts, national segments or something like that. This is a challenge for the future. With the policy development, will the internet remain free, or will it, what some people have called the healthy internet, where a government declares this is good or this is bad? That means, will we have a more open internet, or will it dominated by security measures, control, oversight, surveillance? If come to the management, will it be top-down or bottom-up? Will it be multi-stakeholder or governmental, commercial controlled? All these are open questions, difficult to answer at this stage. But whatever happens, one thing is for sure. Internet governance will remain the subject of high-level political controversy, and it will be about power and money. Thank you very much.